family what is happening. I can rely with Philip today, what is happening in Harare. So we give the time to Philip. I'm not going to take much time of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I can only say I'm utterly humbled and delighted that so many people have come today. Pelagia has been magnificent at organising this function. We met in London a couple of months ago and we were talking about coming to Leicester. Now I live in Turkey, so when Pelagia says it's a journey, it quite literally is a journey. In some sense I've been travelling here since 2 o'clock on Monday morning, so I really am, there have been some stops along the way, but I'm really feeling how great it is to have arrived here and seen such a fantastic audience. I'm going to spend the first part of our time. I'll read you some passages from my book, which is called Zimbabwe, Years of Hope and Despair, which deals with what Pelagia was telling you about my biography. I'll try not to take too much time, but there are some episodes you're going to want to hear about, which I'll tell you about. I know you're all experts, so I'll skip most of the introductions and explanations and context which I give to audiences generally. After I've read some passages, I think the most important part of our session is for you to make comments, enter the discussion, ask the questions which you have. I'm not promising I can answer the questions you have, but I'll happily try if it makes sense for me to do so. But I'm always delighted with any feedback on the book and on the experiences I describe, so it would be wonderful to have that. The heart of my book is about the 2008 elections. I was one of the international election observers for those elections. I was attached to the British Embassy. I was working as a British diplomat. So I had a really unique opportunity to go out across the whole country. On election day I was touring around polling stations, seeing what was going on, and through the subsequent months of, which I think you know turned out pretty badly, I was there as well, observing at first hand in often quite painful detail what was happening. So I'll jump straight to that because I think that's maybe what you as a group are most interested in, and I do want to respect the time we've got. So I'll start by reading you a little passage about what it was like to be an observer on election day in March 2008. I'm sure you all remember the build-up. We were all kind of dreading that the government that had been in power for so long would just stay in power, and we didn't really expect very much was going to change. But actually we were ready for a big surprise. It was still dark when I woke at 5 AM on 29th of March, Zimbabwe's election day. I had travelled down to Masvingo the night before so that I could reach a rural polling station by the time it opened at 7 AM. But even pre-positioned, I had to start early. The road east from Masvingo was dark, but wide and empty. As usual, the Zimbabwean night was warm and comforting to me. I was excited to be part of such an important day in such a strange but wonderful country. Every few kilometres I saw activity at polling stations. Most made use of school buildings, but some were being set up in tents along the roadside to service rural areas too thinly populated even to merit a school. As usual, work was divided along gender lines. Women were stirring up fires to cook a breakfast of tea and sadza. Men were moving papers around, trying to look important. Just as they had said they would, tens of thousands of polling officers had slept uncomfortably at their posts to guard their supplies of papers and boxes, and to be sure they were ready to open at 7 AM. The car lights showed the way ahead clearly, but the sides of the road were in darkness. I started to glimpse people, thousands of people walking to vote. They were hard to see as they generally wore dark clothing, but I could sense their movement somehow. They weren't walking fast or racing to get ahead of each other, but rolling along steadily, using a minimum of scarce energy in great numbers. It was the people of Zimbabwe, rejecting passivity, rejecting a fatalistic assumption of a grim destiny. They had woken in the middle of the night, eaten breakfast if food was available, and begun to walk, perhaps 15 kilometres, to join a queue that might take 4 hours to clear. So great was their desire to shape the nation's decision on its future. I marvelled at the resilience and stamina of so many people, with poor shoes, insufficient food, and little intellectual cause for optimism. Where did their basic desire to vote come from? Did they all know something? A collective secret, a shared hope that I did not? I sensed that something was happening that my brain had not thought possible. As I say, I spent the day touring around polling stations and seeing what was going on. And I'll skip on to the evening. In the evening I went to watch the votes being counted. So I was, I think I can say fairly proudly, I was one of the first people to have a good idea of what was happening in this election. And I'll tell you now what that was like. It was 6 p.m. Dusk was falling and everything in Zaka was quiet. The smoke of cooking fires rose only slowly through the still air. Everybody who was going to vote had done so. But the count could not begin until 7 p.m, so polling staff were taking the opportunity to cook some evening salsa, sit quietly with a cigarette or stretch out for a nap. Night fell and it was suddenly pitch black. With so many demands on Zimbabwe's scarce electricity that night, there was none for Zaka. The embassy tells its staff not to walk around at night, but I felt happy doing so. Zaka had felt benign to me all day. I couldn't see any danger coming from the people I'd met. In the darkness, I heard rather than saw people gathering at the registration office where I decided to observe the count. There were some observers in 2005 who were locked in their counts until dawn, so I hid my mobile and some food and water in my day sack and went inside. At the centre of the room was a large trestle table surrounded by a dozen participants in the count. The returning officer and his assistants, agents of the parties, an independent observer, and me. The returning officer, Tobias, worked slowly and carefully through the instructions in his manual. The guidance was long and complicated and hard to read by candlelight. Tobias stood gripping the edge of the table, looking intently down, moving the process along one small step at a time. More than 2 hours later, Tobias showed no sign of losing bladder control, but I was not feeling so comfortable. I tried following people who disappeared occasionally through a door in the back and found there were toilets there, which hadn't been cleaned in a long time. I started making regular visits so that I could text reports back to colleagues in Harare, who emailed them on to London. I had to be concise though, as the stench was appalling. Sometime after 10 p.m, Tobias suddenly told the slumbering polling officers that they could now count the votes for each candidate. The women sprang to life and grabbed ballots chaotically, shouting out and flinging papers at each other. Mugabe, Makoni, Shvangarai. Tobias tried to referee the frenzy and finally persuaded his colleagues to collaborate in producing 3 piles. One was just a few papers. The second was a decent pile, an inch tall. The third was a tottering tower. Even after everything I'd seen, I was still sure that the large pile had to be Mugabe's. But I was so wrong. The smallest pile was Simba Makoni's, 11 votes. The middling pile was Mugabe's, 44 votes. Amazingly, incredibly, the tallest pile belonged to Morgan Shvangarai. The polling officer, drooping with fatigue, after 16 hours of work, kept losing count. At one point, she became tongue-tied at 127 and had to start again. She sighed desperately, but finally managed to finish her count, 167. Shvangarai had won about 3/4 of the vote. It was midnight when Tobias finally said we could all go. I stepped out of the stuffy building into the rich darkness outside. There were a few lights 300 metres away, in a building where results were being added together, but otherwise I was surrounded by the kind of dense blackness in which I could hardly see my own hand. The Milky Way stretched out over me. I just stood staring upwards, not really sure what I wanted to do next. I jumped when a policeman, who had walked very quietly up behind me, whispered in my ear, "Mr. Philip, we are so pleased you are here, but do you really think there is hope?" For the first time in more than 2 years in Zimbabwe, I thought the answer might be yes. So that was election day 2008, and I think we all know that ushered in a few days where we felt a tremendous hope, a tremendous sense that maybe something was going to change. I think we all felt that we saw quite quickly that the MDC had replaced ZANU-PF as the biggest party in Parliament, and we all got a strong impression, as I got first hand there, of the fact that Morgan Tsvangirai had also beaten Mugabe in the presidential vote. That area, Zaka and Mashvingo, where I was an area which had always voted Mugabe up till this point. So it was very significant to me that 3/4 of the voters had chosen Tsvangirai. I couldn't see how in a place like that he could get such a strong vote and not win overall. But unfortunately, that hope that we felt wasn't the end of the story. A quite substantial and brutal campaign of violence was rolled out against the communities and the people who'd supported Morgan Tsvangirai. I carried on working as an election observer, touring around the country and seeing more and more of the victims of these attacks, and in some cases getting caught up in the attacks myself. And I'll read you now about another visit. This is again to Mashvingo in June 2008, so this is skipping on a couple of months, when this campaign of violence was really at its height. At that moment, the provincial chair at the... I should say, by the way, some of these, the two passages I'm about to read are quite graphic and upsetting. So if anyone doesn't want to hear it, or they're worried about their children hearing it, then you might want to take precautions. At that moment, the provincial chair at the MDC called to tell me that the party office in Jarera, near Zaka, had been firebombed. I drove as fast as possible to Zaka and went into the police headquarters. The officer in charge said he had heard nothing about an attack, but would investigate immediately. The officer was a superb liar, and I believed him, but he was actually just trying to put me off the scent. The moment I left, he must have told 2 policemen to get to the site of the attack as quickly as possible and ensure that I couldn't inspect it. I drove on to Jarera, another 10 kilometres down a wide, empty road. I was going fast, but the police Land Rover that overtook me was going much faster. I found the place easily, partly because the building was a blackened shell, and partly because the speeding police jeep had pulled up in front of it, and 2 policemen were stationed 50 metres away, waving their arms, telling me to turn back. For the only time in the whole sordid campaign, I lost my temper and let it show. The policemen were doddering rural plods, and I wasn't scared of them. I said I was going to see the building as an accredited observer, and they couldn't stop me. I asked them who they had arrested for this attack. They shrugged, and I called them war criminals, complicit in concealing serious human rights abuses. I took out my camera and photographed the MDC office, which was completely gutted. They told me to stop, but I could keep them away simply by swinging the camera at them and asking if I should take their pictures too. They were scared of this, knowing, I believe, they were acting in a grotesquely immoral and illegal way. They weren't the type of ZANU-PF thugs who would carry out such an attack, but they were covering it up and they knew it. I drove on to the local mission hospital, where I found a Swiss doctor. He had courageously come to Zimbabwe for a year as a volunteer, but was shaken by what he had got caught up in and was desperate to flee the country. He brought in his patient, one of 3 men who had survived the attack and the least badly injured. The survivor I spoke to was Peter, the Secretary General at the MDC in Zaka. His hands were thickly bandaged, his arms and legs raw and burned, his hair and scalp charred and blackened. He spoke very quietly, with remote, disengaged eyes. I had no doubt that he was telling me the truth. Armed men not in uniform had come to the MDC offices at 4 AM the night before. The MDC had decided that party members should sleep at the office to protect it from break-in. The armed men smashed the door down and told the 6 party members who had been sleeping there to lie down. When they started to pour petrol over the MDC men, 3 resisted and were shot. Peter hoped they had been killed instantly, because the militia then set all 6 men alight and left, blocking the doorway. Peter was able to beat the flames out with his hand and tear off his burning clothes before fleeing through the back of the building. He escaped with burns to his head, feet and hands. His 2 colleagues who had not been shot also survived, but had suffered terrible burns, 30% and 40% respectively. They were in an ambulance travelling to Mashvingo's larger hospital, but it was not at all certain that they would live. The 3 men who had all been shot, who had been shot, were all dead, one way or another. As you know, politics in Zimbabwe, like many things in Zimbabwe, is quite male-dominated. It's quite hierarchical in its structure. But women were not exempt from the violence that went on through that period. In fact, in many ways, women suffered worst because while men could often flee from a situation, women were often stuck at home with childcare or other family care responsibilities. And there are also, of course, other horrors which women could suffer. And I interviewed some women